Okay, so keep your Bibles open at Numbers chapter 13, and I'm going to flick into Numbers 14 as well. Some of you might have read it earlier. Don't worry if you didn't. We'll work our way through it, and you'll figure it out, hopefully, as we go along. I wonder, as you were listening to what Johnny was saying, and maybe you've read some of the chapters earlier, I wonder if you were to come up with a word that sums up those chapters, what would it be? There are a number of legitimate options, I guess. Maybe frustration is one. Maybe unbelief is another. If you think of Joshua and Caleb, you might be more optimistic. You might use a word like resilience, or defiance, or determination. Or maybe you think about Moses into chapter 14, you might use a word like leadership, or perseverance. Whenever I read these chapters, and particularly whenever I think about them within the context of the rest of the book of Numbers and God's people's journey up until this point, there's one word that comes to mind. It's the word tragedy. Because I think these chapters should go very differently. They should tell us of the triumphant conclusion to the Exodus story. They should tell us of God's people believing His promises and finally entering into the promised land. They should speak of one of the great high points in the life of the people of God. Instead, the opposite happens. This is a watershed moment in the history of God's people. Instead of believing His promises, they doubt Him and question His goodness. Instead of entering the promised land, the whole generation end up wandering in the wilderness for 40 years. Instead of enjoying the land flowing with milk and honey, that whole generation dies in the wilderness. And instead of remembering who they were, God's covenant people, they freak out at the sight of their enemies, and they convince themselves that they are as insignificant as tiny little grasshoppers. And yet, even in the tragedy, there is much for us to learn. There's much for us to learn about the faithfulness of God and how we should live in light of His faithfulness. And in particular, I think there's much for us to learn as people who seek to be leaders in these chapters. Some of you are in positions of leadership. Some of you, as your life progresses, will find yourselves in more positions of leadership. And so I think as we think about these chapters, we've got to think, what are they teaching us about what it means to be a godly leader? And that's part of the lens through which I want to look at these chapters. They're actually some of the most alluded to stories in the rest of the Bible. They're mentioned in the Psalms, they're mentioned in the prophets, they're mentioned a couple of times in the New Testament at different points. And every single time this story is mentioned, it is always as a warning to us. We saw that last night, didn't we, in 1 Corinthians chapter 10. And there are warnings for us to heed in these verses as well. So whenever we're looking at this story, I want us to think a little bit about the examples, and I want us particularly to be thinking as leaders, what are some of the examples for us from this story? So there's 3 things, not 6. Okay. First thing, we've got to look at the fruit. All right. Secondly, we've got to hate bad buts. All right. I'll explain what I mean by that. And then lastly, we've got to remember the promises. Okay. So these are the 3 things we're going to look at. Firstly, then, we've got to look at the fruit, okay? The story begins with God telling Moses to send some men to explore the land. So that in the first couple of verses of chapter 13. And clearly, Moses and the Israelites are Presbyterians, because the first thing they do when there is a land that needs exploring, or a task that needs accomplished, is to form a committee, right? And they form a committee of 12 men, and they go and check out the land, and the committee returns, and any doubt as to whether or not they're Presbyterians is dispelled, because upon their return they disagree. So 10 of the spies, someone's a Presbyterian, I thought that was funny. 10 of the spies speak of the difficulties in conquering the land, and there's 2 of them, Joshua and Caleb, who give a positive report, and it's Caleb in particular in verse 30 of chapter 13 who is really confident in the promises of God. He is absolutely convinced that the land can be taken. So here we have it, God's people are on the precipice of entering the promised land, and they are faced with 2 reports. 10 guys are saying, no way can we make it, the people are powerful, the cities are fortified, they even have giants there. And up against that stand Joshua and Caleb, who show the people the big bunch of grapes, the pomegranates and the figs, and they say, look at this fruit. It's all that God has promised and more. It's even better than we imagined. Let's go and take it. We can do it. So the question then becomes one of perspective for the people of God. Will they focus on the fruit, or will they focus on the obstacles? It's a question of perspective for the people. Of course, we've got to say that the obstacles were significant, right? The people really were powerful. The cities, they really were fortified. The giants, well, they really were giants, as far as we can tell. Whenever I think about ministry in Lurgan, Hill Street, but ministry anywhere, really, we've got to be real and recognise that there are tons and tons and tons of giants and obstacles in our path almost all of the time. Sometimes whenever I think about living as a Christian, as a young person now, it just seems as though there are so many potential pitfalls for you guys. You live in a culture that is changing at a faster pace than I can keep up with. I was talking to some year 9 girls in my office the other day, and they started talking to me about, let me get this name right, Saffron somebody. She's a YouTuber, am I getting that right? No? Yes? Someone knows? I'm like, who are you talking about, and what could she be saying that's so important that you have to watch a video of her every single day? The culture that we live in is changing at a faster pace than I can keep up with anyway. We live in a culture that is incredibly confused about lots and lots of different things. It is incredibly broken in areas of ethics, identity, gender, sexuality, to name but a few. The lust for success, the obsession with greed, rampant selfishness are defining marks of the culture that we live in. And on top of all that, even the good Christians, even the people who we're optimistic about at times, they are marked by an apathy and half-heartedness towards God and His gospel. The world we live in and minister to is incredibly broken and lost. The giants and the obstacles are real. You guys increasingly are living in what I call a Judges 21 culture, where you have no king. In many cases you want no king. And as Judges end, it's with those harrowing little words, everyone did what was right in his own eyes. That's the culture that we live in today. And it's a mess. The giants are real. The obstacles are many. But here's the thing, right? The fruit is real as well. There is much for us to be excited about and optimistic about in Christian ministry today. There are young people who are meeting Jesus. There are young people who are understanding more and more what it means to be a disciple. There are young people who are developing deep and vibrant faith in the Lord Jesus. There are young people who are praying for their friends and their families and their town and their nation. There are young people who are getting serious about serving on their front line, young people who are being generous with their time and their money, young people who are choosing against all the odds to live faithfully for God in this hostile culture. The obstacles are real, but so is the fruit. There is much for us to be encouraged about and optimistic about in these days. And when you look closely at the passage, you'll notice that the focus of the people is on the giants, the problems, the obstacles, and it's not on the fruit. The people focus on the obstacles and they come up with reasons not to move into the land. What had they done? They'd forgotten God's promises. They'd forgotten that the land flowed with milk and honey. They lost sight of who God was and all that He had done for them and all that He had promised to them. So part of our challenge in leadership, part of your challenge in leadership, is to help people see the fruit and not just the obstacles. Because I think that's what the leaders do in the passage. Moses and Aaron seem completely convinced of the promises of God. They believe the report of Joshua and Caleb. That's what leaders are supposed to do, isn't it? To believe and trust in God despite the obstacles, to cling to His promises. You know something, in leadership and in ministry, there will always be reasons for you not to do things. Sometimes those are legitimate reasons. We've got to use wisdom and listen to godly wisdom in our lives. There will always be reasons for us not to take risks. Our instinct, a lot of the time, maybe especially in Northern Ireland, tends to be risk averse. But I think we need to learn and relearn to trust God, to see beyond the obstacles, and to look at the fruit. There's an author, a blogger who I read from time to time, is a man called Andrew Wilson. There's a quote of his, hopefully that's going to be on the screen. There we go. He talks about what sort of leaders are required for the church today. He says the church requires leaders for whom courage matters more than caution. I love that. For whom theological clarity matters more than affability, people liking you. Fight matters more than finesse. Shepherds, not game show hosts. So listen, you guys, as you lead, right? Part of your job, in fact, the way I want you to think of yourself is to be a shepherd. It's the primary biblical paradigm for leadership. To care for the sheep, people, that God has given you to care for. Being a shepherd is not about people liking you all the time. It's not about being super cool, being a game show host. It's not about being a know-it-all. It's not about being a control freak. It's about being someone who cares for, protects, and feeds, looks after, runs after the sheep. And of course, part of our job as a shepherd is to protect the flock from the dangers and obstacles that they'll face. But actually, part of our job is to equip the flock to actually take risks and do something for God. Joshua and Caleb were men of such courage. They remained true to their convictions. They trusted that God was greater than any obstacle, greater than their enemies, greater than the cities, greater than the giants. They had complete confidence in God and His promises. I think as leaders, we've got to do the same. Brings us on to the second point. We've got to hate bad buts. Okay? That's buts with one T, by the way. So look at chapter 13 and verses 26 to 28. Spies coming back to Moses, and it says, they, the spies, came back to Moses and Aaron and the whole Israelite community of Kadesh in the desert of Paran. They reported to them and to the whole assembly, showed them the fruit of the land. They gave Moses this account: we went into the land in which you sent us, and it does flow with milk and honey. Here's its fruit. They showed them the pomegranates, the figs, right? 28. But the people who live there are powerful. The cities are very large and fortified. We even saw descendants of Anak there. And so the fear of the obstacles is beginning to grip these 10 spies. The seeds of doubt have been sown in their minds. And then look what happens when Caleb interjects in verse 30. Verse 30, then Caleb silenced the people before Moses and said, we should go up and take possession of the land, for we can certainly do it. Right? He's a hero. Verse 31, but the men who had gone up with him said, we can't attack those people. They're stronger than we are. And so the seeds of doubt are growing. And if you had time to read it, by the time we get to chapter 14, their doubt has turned to outright unbelief. If you look at chapter 14 and verse 10, you'll see that they want to stone Joshua and Caleb by that point. And if you look back up to verses 3 and 4 of chapter 14, they decide that life would be better for them back in Egypt. And so they want to ditch Moses and choose a new leader to take them back where God had just rescued them from. Clearly, the people at this point have pretty short memories, right? What was life like for them back in Egypt? It was horrendous for them in Egypt. They were horribly oppressed there. Pharaoh was killing all the firstborn Israelite males, not to mention the whole Red Sea thing. I imagine that's a pretty awkward conversation when you rock out back in Egypt. We're really sorry that your whole army got killed in the Red Sea, but we're back now. With pretty short memories of what life was like for them back in Egypt. What's it teaching us? I think we're meant to see something really, really important, and if you're writing stuff down, you've got to write this down. It's teaching us that sin has an irrational madness to it. Sin has an irrational madness to it. Because what starts out here as doubt very quickly leads to unbelief. And unbelief is when we hear and know the promises of God. I have given you the land, and we say, but, ... When we allow our doubts, which can often be legitimate, right? But when we allow those doubts to turn to unbelief, we are on a dangerous trajectory, spiritually speaking. And so we need to be wary of the dangers of unbelief. Because the actions of the people here are not small things. It's not just an act of panic and desperation. Their actions here, when you think about it in the bigger picture of what's happening, it's a complete rejection of the whole plan of redemption. What had God done for them? He had rescued them out of Egypt. What do they want to do? They want to go back to Egypt. It's a complete rejection of God and His promises. It's a complete rejection of God Himself. You remember what we said about these guys last night? They are the golden generation, right? They are a numbered, a represented, a set apart, blessed, spoken to, and protected people. They are as good as it gets in the Old Testament, and yet they are rejecting the God who has saved them. At one point they're walking through the desert and singing, "Everything is awesome." And now the song has changed. Chapter 14, verse 1, they are crying. Verse 2, they are moaning and complaining. They want to go back to Egypt. Sin has an irrational madness to it. I'm sure, right, you see this in the lives of people in your schools. You see it with your friends. Maybe you can see it in your own life a little bit. People who you have invested in. You have shared your life with them. You have cared for them. You have prayed for them. And you see them making decisions that are a blatant rejection of God and His ways. And there are times where you look on and you think, what are you doing? I've seen that in my job. Young people who I've loved as best I can, served as best I can, and make decisions that just are a rejection of God and His ways. And that's heartbreaking. They are choosing the emptiness of life without God instead of the fullness of life with Him. Why? The answer, theologically speaking, is because there is a madness to sin. And if we're honest, we find it so alluring so often. C.S. Lewis wrote a book called The Weight of Glory. He wrote it in the early 1940s, right? It's a long time ago, but these words are timeless, I think. He says this, he says, if we consider the unblushing promises of reward and the staggering nature of the rewards promised in the Gospels, it would seem that our Lord finds our desires not too strong, but too weak. We are half-hearted creatures, fooling about with drink and sex and ambition, while infinite joy is offered us. Like an ignorant child who wants to go on making mud pies in his slum because he cannot imagine what is meant by the offer of a holiday at the sea. We are far too easily pleased. What a description of the human condition. Part of our challenge as leaders is to help people see that sin has an irrational madness to it. That abandoning God and His ways is the most foolish thing that they can do. And to help them see that actually life to its full is found in a relationship with the Lord Jesus Christ. So we've got to hate bad butts, right? We've got to flee from the cancer of compromise and unbelief. And we've got to trust wholeheartedly in the promises of God. The last lesson in the story, very simply, we've got to remember the promises. See, what the 10 spies, I think, had lost sight of was what God had said to Moses in the very first verses of chapter 13. You maybe even missed it when it was being read out. Look at the end of verse 1 and the start of chapter 2. It says, the Lord said to Moses, send some men to explore the land of Canaan, and here it comes, which I am giving to the Israelites. And so the unbelief that so plagues the people stems from this failure to remember that God was going to give them the land, right? And if God was promising to give them the land, then it didn't matter how powerful the people were, how fortified the cities were, or how big the giants were. God was promising this. The God who had smitten down the Egyptians, the God who had opened the Red Sea, the God who had brought them through the wilderness, He was promising these things. But they had forgotten that. The story does read like a tragedy, right? But it's not without its heroes. Joshua and Caleb are complete heroes in the story. They have full confidence in the promises of God. No one could ever accuse them of being risk-averse or too cautious. But I actually think if you read into chapter 14, Moses is also a hero in the story. We didn't have time to read it tonight, but you should. He comes under immense pressure from the people, right? So much so that they want to replace him, as we've said. And under all of that pressure, God comes to him, right? Look at verse 12 of chapter 14. God comes to Moses and He says, I will strike them, that's the people, down with a plague and destroy them. These are the people who are looking to get rid of Moses, right? But I will make you, Moses, into a nation greater and stronger than they. So God's promising, offering, to wipe out these people who are opposing Moses, these people who want to kill him. He's offering to wipe them out and to start again with him and his family. Now I imagine at this point, right, this sounds pretty appealing to Moses. No more complaining, grumbling, crying people. Result, no more complaining, no more having to put up with these absolute donuts. Start again with a blank slate. And actually, when you think about it, the chance to start again with him and his name, to have a little bit more of the glory for himself. I imagine this sounds incredibly enticing. Would have done for me. But not Moses. There is no hint whatsoever in the text that Moses is enticed by that offer. In fact, in verses 13 to 19, he intercedes on behalf of the people before God. In fact, very specifically, he appeals to God on the basis of God's own promises. Moses knows that the very honour and glory of God's name is at stake here, and so he pleads for the people. You want an example of leadership? What an example. He isn't concerned with making a name for himself, rather he spends himself for the sake of the people. And he pleads their case before God. Part of your job as a leader is not just to be organised, not just to make sure that things run on time, not just to book good speakers. It is to do this. This is the hard work of leadership. To intercede for the people that God has given you. To be on your knees before him, pleading their case before him. Trusting that he is still slow to anger. He is still abounding in love. He is still ready to forgive their sin. I don't know about you, but whenever I read those verses in chapter 14, sometimes I can find myself thinking, well, hang on a little minute, does this make Moses the goody here who intercedes on behalf of the people, and God in some way the baddie who's all angry and vengeful? It's a picture that messed with my head for a little bit, I have to confess. But then I ask myself, well, how does Moses get here in the first place? Who has put Moses here, if you like, in this position of leadership? It's God who has put Moses here. So actually you have this wonderful and mysterious picture here, right? Of God providing an intercessor for his own people to shield them from his own wrath. It's an incredible picture. His love for his people is so great that he provides a rescuer for them. Of course, we're meant to join the dots, aren't we? And see that this intercession is pointing us to a much greater intercession, where in the New Testament, Jesus, the very Lamb of God, would be the one who shields us from the wrath of God. Not by begging for our lives, as Moses does for the people here, but by selflessly offering up his own life. And so whenever we remember the promises, we've got to remember that all of the promises of God find their yes and amen in the Lord Jesus Christ. Every story whispers his name. The story ends then with a whole generation being condemned to life and then death in the wilderness. It's tragic. None of the adult population of Israel will enter the promised land except for two people, Joshua and Caleb. But even before they get to do that, they have to wander around for another 40 years. I imagine for those guys, that's a tough 40 years, right? They have been to the promised land. They have seen it with their own eyes. They have walked around it. They have tasted its fruit. But they have to wait. I'm sure they have periods of real frustration and discouragement in those 40 years. They must have had times where they wondered, are we ever going to get to see it again? As people around them drop off and die, they go to funeral after funeral after funeral after funeral. And they're waiting to enter the promised land. You can read about them entering the promised land. It's class. It's an amazing bit of the Bible. It's in Joshua chapter 14. We don't have time to read it all, but let me read you a couple of verses from Joshua chapter 14. This is when Caleb's finally getting to go to the promised land. Right? Joshua 14, verse 7, it says, I was 40 years old when Moses, the servant of the Lord, sent me from Kadesh Barnea to explore the land, and I brought him back a report concerning my convictions. My fellow Israelites who went up with me made the hearts of the people melt in fear. I, however, followed the Lord my God wholeheartedly. So on that day Moses swore to me, the land in which your feet have walked will be your inheritance, and that of your children forever, because you have followed the Lord your God wholeheartedly. Now then, just as the Lord promised, confidence in the promises of God, He has kept me alive for 45 years since the time He said this to Moses, while Israel moved about in the wilderness. So here I am today, 85 years old. I am still as strong today as the day Moses sent me out. I am just as vigorous to go to battle now as I was then. Now give me the hill country that the Lord has promised to me on that day. You yourself know that the Anakites were there. Their cities were large and fortified, but the Lord helping me, I will drive them out just as He said. He's 85 years old, Caleb, and he is spoiling for a fight. Not just any old fight. He says to Joshua, give me the Anakites. I'm going after the giants. And listen, it's not because he's thinking, I'm a super strong warrior, right? He is relying completely on the strength of God. He has been faithful for 45 years. Now his moment has come. He has trusted God all this time. He is going to continue to trust Him. He has complete confidence in the promises of God. I don't know what your situation is as you've been here this week. I have seen you be learning lots throughout today. It's been a joy and a privilege to watch you do that. It has been incredibly encouraging for me to watch that. I'm sure that as some of you are here, you're really encouraged, you're really optimistic about how things are going in your school and your ministry. Like Caleb, perhaps you are spoiling for a fight. You are excited for what the Lord can do in you and through you this year. And if that's you, praise the Lord, right? Be encouraged. Go for it. When you get back, go for it. Do something incredible for God. But maybe you're here and you're actually finding it pretty hard at the minute. Life and ministry is maybe full of challenges for you. Maybe you think about your school and you're not encouraged, you're pretty discouraged. I mean, you're glad to be here, to be learning stuff. But a little bit of you is also sort of dreading being here a little bit, because you hear all these stories of other people and their issues, and it sounds brilliant, and yours is like, oh, it's not that great. You're dreading some of those conversations. Well, how's it going? You've had those conversations and you're sort of like, yeah, it's fine. Inside you know, panicking or a bit. Or maybe you sort of oscillate in between those two realities, like most of us do. And some days you're incredibly encouraged, some days you are really discouraged and you want to pack it all in. Can I plead with you tonight, right? Wherever you find yourself on that spectrum, please, 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 remember the promises of God. Remember Joshua and Caleb. In the same way that God wasn't finished with them, remember that He is not finished yet with you. Philippians 1, God who has begun this work in you will carry it through to completion. Remember the promises. And remember the promise of our inheritance. Our promised land is infinitely greater than the one that Joshua and Caleb received. Revelation 21 and 22, this is where the whole story is headed. The new heavens, the new earth, the promise that the kingdom will one day be fully realized, the dwelling of God will once again be with man. We are headed for a new creation. And yes, there'll be days when it's hard, right? There are days when it's really hard. There'll be days when it's great. And you're like, Caleb, you don't fight. And there'll be days in between where you're just kind of so. Hold your nerve. Remember the promises. Lift up your head. You're God's covenant people. Keep pressing on. Even when you feel like nothing is happening, keep pressing on. Hold your nerve. Let's stick it all in the promises of God. Let's pray.